My parents made me stay in the garage while my privileged sibling had two rooms. When they needed a place to stay after a disaster, I simply pointed out that the garage was still an option for them. I've never been one to shy away from life's twisted ironies, even when those ironies were chiseled into the very walls of my childhood. Growing up, I was forced to inhabit a world that seemed designed to remind me daily of my so-called lesser status. My parents made me stay in the garage while my privileged sibling basked in the luxury of two sunlit rooms, each one carefully curated to exude warmth and comfort. The garage wasn't a room at all. It was a dark, concrete cell, with peeling paint, the air heavy with the scent of oil and dust, a place that became both my refuge and my prison. I remember staring through a grimy window at the laughter echoing from the bright spaces that my sibling called home, feeling both invisible and determined to prove that the worth of a person isn't measured by the square footage of their bedroom. A child, I clung to a secret conviction that the very neglect I endured was forging something unbreakable inside me. While my sibling was enveloped in an environment of privilege and ease, I learned to find beauty in solitude and strength in silence. The cold metal of the garage door and the persistent hum of a leaking pipe became my unlikely lullabies. I spent countless nights mapping out dreams on scraps of paper, plotting a future that transcended the narrow confines of my designated storage space. Every creak of the old door and every echo in the vast emptiness of that garage whispered secrets of resilience and whispered promises of a day when I would command respect, not by the size of my room, but by the depth of my resolve. That day, when disaster struck our seemingly perfect world, the universe seemed to conspire to upend every notion of fairness my family had so long taken for granted. It began with a low, ominous rumble that grew into a cacophony of chaos. I was in the garage, as I always was, immersed in sketches of impossible futures and plans to escape the predetermined roles imposed upon me. Suddenly, frantic shouts shattered the uneasy calm as the main house, once a fortress of opulence, became ground zero for an unfolding catastrophe. My parents, scrambling in panic, were forced to confront the unbearable truth. The sanctuary they so cherished was rapidly becoming a liability. The luxurious rooms, which had once been symbols of status and comfort, were now riddled with hazards and uncertainty, their walls no longer a shield against the encroaching disaster. In the midst of that upheaval, an unexpected clarity washed over me. For years, the garage had been the backdrop to every lonely, difficult moment of my life. And in that moment of collective desperation, I recognized its true value. It wasn't just a space for discarded tools and forgotten memories. It was a testament to survival, a silent repository of every challenge I'd overcome. With a wry, almost imperceptible smile, I stepped out from the shadows and, with a calm that belied the storm raging around us, suggested that perhaps the garage was the perfect refuge. The irony was as palpable as the tension in the air. Here was the very place I had been forced to call home, now being offered as the solution to a crisis my family had never anticipated. My statement wasn't an act of spite. It was a declaration of independence, a quiet, steadfast refusal to be defined by the arbitrary measures of privilege. In that charged silence that followed, I saw something shift in my parents' eyes. Their expressions, once so self-assured and dismissive, now carried hints of vulnerability and, perhaps, a dawning realization that life's true shelter isn't measured by opulence, but by the resilience of one's spirit. As chaos swirled outside, the garage's unpretentious walls suddenly felt like a fortress built on years of hardship and perseverance. I began to recount my memories, of nights when the steady drip of water had lulled me into a fragile sleep, of mornings when the feeble glow of dawn filtered through a tiny window and promised a new beginning. Each recollection was a silent act of defiance against a past that had sought to diminish me. In sharing those stories, I wasn't seeking pity or forgiveness. I was affirming that my existence, forged in the crucible of neglect, had its own intrinsic value. The transformation wasn't instantaneous. As the day wore on, the initial shock of disaster gave way to a reluctant acceptance of our new reality. My parents, stripped of their usual airs of superiority, began to see the irony of their situation. In the midst of a crumbling world, the so-called lesser space I had been condemned to was now our safest haven. I spent that chaotic morning clearing away the detritus of years, old tools, discarded mementos, and the weight of unspoken grievances that had accumulated over time. Each sweep of my broom was a symbolic act of reclamation, a way to purge the past and assert that I, too, was worthy of respect and dignity. As the sun crept over the horizon, its rays slowly illuminating the battered concrete floor, a quiet unity began to emerge. In that modest space, I could see the beginning of something transformative, a collective understanding that home is not defined by lavish rooms or the superficial trappings of wealth, but by the strength and character of those who inhabit it. My parents' eyes, once clouded by the illusions of privilege, now searched mine with a tentative respect, as if they were beginning to grasp that the true measure of a person is forged in adversity, not in comfort. I found myself reflecting on the profound irony of my journey, from being the forgotten child in the garage to becoming its unwavering guardian in our darkest hour. Every dent, every scratch, every echo that reverberated off those walls bore witness to a lifetime of struggle and, ultimately, resilience. In that moment, I realized that the garage was more than a physical space. It was the crucible of my identity. The very place that had symbolized isolation and neglect now embodied the essence of survival, hope, and the undeniable strength that comes from embracing one's own destiny. And so, as the day unfolded in a mix of chaos and quiet reflection, I stood firm in the belief that the garage, my unassuming sanctuary, was more than just a refuge for me. It was a beacon for anyone who had ever felt overlooked or undervalued. It was a reminder that even in the most unexpected places, greatness can be nurtured, and that sometimes the harshest circumstances are the very catalysts for profound transformation. H.A.'s. The night deepened. A heavy, almost tangible stillness settled over the garage, as if every brick and beam was absorbing the lessons of the day. The chaos of the disaster had gradually given way to a fragile sense of order, a whispered promise of renewal that resonated in every crevice. I sat on a worn-out crate, the only piece of furniture that hadn't been scavenged for its memory, and reflected on how the space that once embodied my isolation was now at the center of our collective survival. In that silence, the garage transformed into more than just a refuge. It became a crucible where past grievances, unspoken dreams, and the raw force of resilience converged. In the days that followed, the remnants of our old life, pristine rooms, and luxurious comforts, slowly faded into irrelevance, replaced by a newfound appreciation for the simple, unadorned truth of existence. My parents, who had once reveled in the superficiality of wealth, began to see the glaring absurdity of their former priorities. The disaster had stripped away the veneer of privilege, revealing the raw, unyielding reality beneath. They moved cautiously around the cramped space, their eyes occasionally meeting mine with expressions that mingled regret, wonder, and the dawning recognition of my quiet strength. Even my sibling, whose early life had been cocooned in a world of excess, could not ignore the stark contrast between the opulence they had known and the humbling sanctuary that now sheltered us all. Each morning, as the first weak rays of sunlight seeped through the grimy windows, I would rise with a sense of purpose. I started to repurpose the garage's forgotten corners, transforming a dusty workbench into a communal table, fashioning a makeshift cot from stacked crates and salvaged cushions. Every act of renewal was a quiet rebellion against the life that had been imposed upon me, a declaration that no matter how much they tried to confine me to the margins, I would always find a way to claim my own space. The process was painstaking. I scoured the debris for materials, learned to mend broken tools, and even began to experiment with painting the cold concrete walls in shades that spoke of both melancholy and hope. I was, in many ways, redesigning, not just a physical space, but the very narrative of my existence. One humid afternoon, while meticulously arranging a line of salvaged light fixtures, I heard my sibling's voice, a soft, almost hesitant murmur, asking if they might help. It was a simple offer, but it marked the beginning of an unexpected reconciliation. Our past was fraught with unspoken resentments and memories of unfairness, yet in that moment, as we worked side by side amidst the rubble of our former lives, the rigid lines of our upbringing began to blur. We exchanged stories of the little rebellions we had each committed in secret, the small acts of defiance that, in hindsight, had been our first steps toward liberation. There was no grand reconciliation, no dramatic epiphany, but rather a gradual softening of hardened hearts, a realization that the walls we had built between us were as flimsy as the very barriers our parents had erected long ago. As time passed, our improvised sanctuary grew into a vibrant testament to human ingenuity and the capacity to rebuild amid ruins. The garage, with its patched windows and repurposed fixtures, became a microcosm of our transformation. Neighbors and strangers, drawn by the resilience that radiated from our humble abode, began to stop by, initially out of curiosity, then in admiration. They saw in our struggle a mirror of their own hidden battles, a reminder that sometimes the most profound strength emerges from the darkest of circumstances. In quiet conversations that stretched into the late hours, we shared our fears and our hopes, each tale a thread woven into the tapestry of our collective recovery. Yet, amid the reconstruction and the slow healing of old wounds, I couldn't shake the bittersweet taste of irony. The very garage that had once symbolized my enforced insignificance was now the hearth of our new beginning. I often found myself caught between two worlds, the memory of a childhood steeped in neglect and the promise of a future built on self-determination. The scars left by years of being undervalued were not easily erased, but they had imparted a wisdom that no gilded room could ever offer. I began to understand that true strength wasn't a product of comfort or luxury. It was born out of adversity, tempered by the relentless pursuit of one's own worth. The garage had taught me that the measure of a person lies not in the space they occupy, but in the legacy they forge through resilience and compassion. In quiet moments of reflection, I would trace my fingers along the rough, worn surfaces of the walls, each groove a silent chronicle of past trials. Those imperfections, once sources of shame, now felt like medals of honor, a physical record of battles fought and victories won. I learned to embrace the imperfections, seeing in them a narrative of survival that was as much a part of me as the scars etched on my soul. There was a profound beauty in the flawed, in the raw honesty of a space that had witnessed both despair and hope. Every dent in the metal, every crack in the concrete, whispered stories of persistence, reminding me that life's true art is crafted in the spaces between our triumphs and our defeats. As the weeks turned into months, the chaos of the disaster receded into a distant memory, replaced by the steady rhythm of rebuilding. Our family, once divided by the artificial constructs of privilege and neglect, began to rediscover the bonds that had been long suppressed. In the shared task of creating a home from what had once been a symbol of my isolation, we unearthed a collective strength that none of us had anticipated. The garage, with its newfound vibrancy, stood as a testament to our capacity to reinvent ourselves, even when the very foundations of our past were crumbling around us. Yet, even as we embraced this new chapter, there lingered an unspoken question. Could the lessons of that fateful day ever truly redefine who we were? For my parents, the stark contrast between the life they had known and the reality they were forced to face was a humbling revelation. They began to question the values that had once governed their every decision, the relentless pursuit of material comfort, the unyielding belief in a hierarchy that had long rendered one of their own invisible. In the quiet moments before sleep, I could hear them whispering apologies into the darkness, tentative acknowledgments of the wrongs they had inflicted in the name of tradition and convenience. The process of healing was neither swift nor simple. Old habits and ingrained resentments clashed with the fragile optimism that now filled our days. There were moments of heated argument, echoes of a past where divisions were clearly drawn, and times when the wounds seemed too deep to mend. But in those turbulent hours, I found solace in the steady hum of the garage, the one constant that had witnessed every tear, every burst of laughter, every silent vow to rise again. Its unyielding presence reminded me that growth often emerges from the crucible of pain, and that the path to redemption is paved with both forgiveness and the courage to confront our own shortcomings. I began to document our journey, scribbling, Down fragments of conversation, fleeting glimpses of hope, and the raw, unfiltered truths that had come to define us. Each word was a small act of reclamation, a way to assert that, despite the hardships, we were more than the sum of our past mistakes. I posted snippets of our story online, not for sympathy, but to share a message with those who, like me, had once been relegated to the margins. The response was overwhelming. Strangers reached out with tales of their own battles against injustice and neglect, and a community of kindred spirits emerged, bound by the shared understanding that adversity can, in its cruelest moments, sow the seeds of transformation. Looking back, I now see that the disaster was not merely an external event, but a mirror held up to our collective soul, a catalyst that forced us to confront the fragility of our illusions. The garage, with its battered exterior and humble interiors, had become a symbol of rebirth, a place where we learned that true sanctuary is found not in the comforts of material wealth, but in the courage to embrace our own vulnerabilities. It taught me that every moment of pain carried the potential for growth, that every act of neglect could be transmuted into a lesson in resilience. In the end, as I stand amidst the quiet hum of our renewed home, I am filled with a sense of gratitude for the irony that once condemned me to solitude. For it was in that very isolation that I discovered the strength to challenge the status quo, to redefine what it means to be truly privileged. The garage, with all its scars and imperfections, remains a constant reminder that sometimes the most profound revelations are born in the most unlikely of places. And while our journey of healing is far from over, I now carry with me the unwavering belief that even in the face of overwhelming odds, we have the power to reclaim our narrative, to transform a place of neglect into a sanctuary of hope, unity, and unwavering resilience.